You're listening to the Pat Kenny Show on Newstalk. We're joined now by Eoghan Corry, who's editor of Air and Travel magazine. Eoghan, good morning.
Good morning, Pat.
Now, we want to obviously sort out this travel business and, green lists and all the rest of it. But you have travelled and therefore you had to re-enter the country. So are you quarantined?
Oh, I am self-isolating for my 14 days. I'm most of the way through my sentence at the moment. What is interesting is that there is a lot of publicity about the form as you arrive in Dublin Airport, very little about quarantine. I can see how it has cropped up that some of the people who arrived here didn't know anything about the quarantine. The locator form is a paper form. I do suspect that's causing problems, Pat, because the volume has gone really far way up. I mean, we were doing 4,000 through the airport, and it's now gone up to 12,000 and 14,000 some days. Can I just make a comment on Tomas talking about flights from Florida and California? There are none. There are no direct flights coming in from California, and as Simon Coveney pointed out yesterday, the numbers are incredibly small. Through the whole of this tremendous challenge to our society, the number of travel-related cases is 1.6%, which means that 98.4 were not. Most of them were in the early stages from Italy. And it's interesting to see the narrative has been so controlled.
But Florida is Italy now.
Well, there are no direct flights from Florida is the point.
In the entire European Union. You know, that's what you're talking about.
Tomas was talking about the direct flight from Florida.
Smaller than the European Union, and they have more cases than the European Union. Governor DeSantis, as you know, is being grossly irresponsible in Florida, refusing
one of Tomas's very interesting points
for public safety.
One of Tomas's very interesting points is that states are quarantining each other. Delaware is quarantining everybody that comes into Delaware. I don't know anyone who ever goes to Delaware. You go through Delaware to get to other places. But the point I'd make, Pat, among all of this, and it's shared around the world, but we are particularly prone to it over the last week, is the tremendous climate of fear. We have coronavirus through our society. It's killed between 1,400 and 1,700 people, whether you go with the post-HICWA figures or the pre-HICWA. And it's a huge haunting our society. The fact that you can sort of turn on travel and say, let's not restart travel because that will sort of save us from it in some way or prevent reinfection. That debate is really over at European level. And we're still in that cyclical...
We're not talking about Europe. I don't hear too many objections to the whole idea of, say, French people coming in or even Spanish students or whatever, because, I mean, the epidemic is somewhat under control, although there have been hotspots. It is not under control in the United States. It is not under control in Arizona, in Oklahoma, in Florida, in California. That's the issue.
And that's where the government has still stuck on the beginning of March, the advice against all non-essential travel worldwide. The aviation task force came up with interim recommendations. They came up with their full report on Friday. The interim recommendations have not been implemented. In the interregnum between the governments, we haven't had the politicians doing what they should do, make the policy. INFIT are doing what they should do, say, let's get the cases down to zero. That means curtail international travel if need be to prevent reinfection cases coming in. The number of cases are tiny, by the way, 140,000 through the airport and 30 cases is very small from where I'm looking. It's not my decision, it's the politicians' decision. And we have to sign up for some sort of roadmap to get our aviation, tourism and travel industries working again. They haven't done it. We're still back in March with the same advice. And what's worrying is the level of invective that has been shown towards people who are travelling, who aren't arriving in the country. And indeed, those tourists from America who can't get into Europe, nobody actually told them you can't get into Ireland. But yet we have now a situation where the HSE is putting on its website, do not associate or do not assume that someone with a foreign accent is a tourist. It is like they are being marginalised in the way that travellers of the other description of travellers have been for many years.
If any cohort, though, was coming from an area, for example, where they had Ebola. You'd be making sure they quarantined.
Good analogy, Pat, yeah. We had 2 importations of Ebola.
Have a situation where people are coming in. I mean, there was one guy, and God help him, he was the fellow who didn't believe, that COVID was serious. He got off the Dallas flight, I think, and he's wandering around Ireland with his missus, saying, he doesn't know anyone who got COVID.
Yeah.
That's the kind of worrying stuff. I mean, the texts we're getting from people saying, yeah, it may be relatively few, but one super spreader can infect tens of thousands of people. Once it starts spreading, it can be incredibly rapid. The doubling rate can be incredibly rapid just from one individual. And if it's an American who is coming to tour Ireland, by God, they tour. Very few stay in the one place. So if you had one such super spreader going into a hotel or a bar in Killarney and then moving on to Clare and then up to Galway and then across to Roscommon, the damage that could be done by that one person, unlike the single person in the nightclub in Seoul who stuck around in the same place and they managed to contact trace, I mean, it could be disastrous.
What's the alternative, Pat? What happens next? I mean, it's no surprise we'll find an American who doesn't have a great notion of the outside world. That most of, the real question, if you decide you're shutting down, you're pulling up the drawbridge, you're keeping people out of the country, what happens next? How long do you shut down for? It's a major question for those countries that have shut down.
My point really is not about shutting the drawbridge, because that, in a sense, I know you mightn't think it, but that's the easy thing to do. That's very draconian but simple.
I've made the point on your show,
down.
yeah.
The hard thing to do is to have proper quarantining, proper testing at the airport, putting people in hotels until they have fulfilled their quarantine, contact tracing, that's the hard thing to do, and that's why we're not doing it. It's just too hard.
It's not just too hard. No country's doing it. They've got more sophisticated ways of tracking. It's quite interesting that the quarantine with the paper, that we alone, and I think Britain did something similar, but we're pretty much standalone in our approach to this. For instance, the airlines who have been working to their own safety agenda with the European CDC and with the EASA offered the Department of Health the contact details of the aviation passengers. You could actually have a situation where somebody tests positive and then you contact people on the aircraft. We're not alone in this, Pat. Every single country that's been reopening, and 24 of the 27 have reopened their borders, and the other 3 are less limited in the people they let in than we are, don't have a quarantine system. They are all looking at what happens with the reinfection. But they've all signed up, or they've all agreed that there is a road plan in place to get international travel working again, because at some stage we're going to have to live beside this virus. And we don't, because we haven't said we agree to the European plan announced on May the 27th or the EASA plan on June the 12th. We actually haven't said we don't agree either. We haven't said we disagree with it. But in the meantime, we have a lot of medical personal opinion, people saying, as Tomas just said, the people who arrive in Ireland wouldn't be the most responsible. It's not based on data, it's not based on numbers, it's not based on infection rates, the things that scientists do. We need the government to step in and say, INFIT, put your case, which is, we want zero, we want those infections down to zero, everybody wants that. But counterbalance with everything else that affects the economy, and ask yourself, is travel as big a problem as you would expect? One of my aunts thinks that travel would be responsible for most of the cases in Ireland instead of the 1.6% that it is, because it's like we fixed on it, and when we're fixing on it, the damage we do isn't so much into outbound, because people are flying outbound on the Ryanair flights anyway. The damage is inbound.
All the cases in Ireland are due to travel.
All the cases.
Because it was brought in. It didn't exist here. It didn't exist here. So it was brought in from Italy, from Cheltenham, from multiple locations perhaps, and it spread. But it all came to this island. It didn't exist on this island before. So in that sense, it began with travel.
Oh.
Then community infection continued the spread. But it started with travel. And that's why people are concerned about people from Florida. One of the Vox Pops, a passenger from Florida, said, I wanted to get out of Florida. It's too bloody dangerous to be there.
All the cases in the world of
Ireland.
All the cases in the world of every epidemic are due to travel, Pat. And when things were less globalised, we had 2 years warning of the cholera epidemic of 1832. We quarantined. It still got through and killed 50,000 people. Throughout history, the epidemic gets in. It does get in. And when you pull up the drawbridge, or when you say curtail travel, you're following a notion which makes perfect sense. You've just articulated very well. If nobody arrives in the country, the epidemic won't arrive. But throughout history, it always has eventually. And it will eventually in the countries like Vanuatu, like Nauru in the Pacific Islands that have no cases. At some stage, the decision is made. This is a big issue, Pat, closer to home. It's a big issue for our offshore islands. Some of them have voted that they don't want to reopen contacts with the mainland. At some stage, somebody has to take the infant advice and all the other factors and say, we're going to have regulated travel. If you regard it, Florida is a hotspot, all the countries that are opening their borders are saying we have problems with one particular country or two particular countries. Sweden tends to be top of everyone's list. Bulgaria, Romania, the UK, some countries are saying no to that. Hungary brought in a yellow list on Sunday. Ireland wasn't on it, the UK was. Manage it. Don't leave this vacuum. It's not even that we've made a decision. We've left this vacuum. July the 9th, July the 20th, green list is going to be published. Oh, no, it's not. Come to some sort of decision and take the advice of the health authorities and don't leave the vacuum.
Yeah, stand over your decision.
Absolutely.
Your job as a politician is to lead. Take the advice or ignore the advice. Take it all into account, whatever you want to do. But basically, do it and stand over it. That's your it.
And we've 200,000 jobs at stake, Pat. Thank you.
All right. Eoghan Corry,
always a pleasure, Pat.
Air and Travel Magazine. Thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to the Pat Kenny Show on Newstalk. Some of the comments: I don't want to hear Simon Coveney apologise as my mother dies from the virus and hear him say that we will learn from the past. Close the airports now, says that texter. Chris says it's bordering on the criminal to allow people into this country from one of the most affected countries in the world for the purpose of a holiday. What an insult to our frontline staff who've given so much, and to those with a compromised immune system. We have dithered so long about masks. Let's not do the same now about inward tourism. That's from Chris. I have a holiday booked for next week in Galway and Clare, but I'm seriously thinking about cancelling it, as the thought of bumping into American tourists is a frightening prospect. We did the right thing during this pandemic, and now we're being absolutely let down by our politicians. From Angela in Dublin 13. Another one: it's Italy and Cheltenham all over. It's an obvious mistake, so why make it? Yeah, that is the problem, I suppose. We did the right thing, and we did it uncomplainingly, I suppose. And the Americans were saying, no, we have to open up our economy and so on and so forth. And therefore, they have a rampant pandemic at the moment. So why should we inherit their mistakes from their tourists? All right, still to come in a moment or two.